Between 1968 and 1985, Herbert Armstrong met with over 300 world leaders, from emperors to kings, ambassadors, presidents and prime ministers, to even leaders of education and finance. It's possible that he met with more world leaders than anyone in human history. Who else is even in the same ballpark? Henry Kissinger? Probably. Billy Graham? Maybe. Pope John Paul II? Possibly. Kissinger, though, was Secretary of State of the United States, and Pope John Paul II and Billy Graham were household names. Herbert Armstrong was a private citizen who led a small church denomination, the Worldwide Church of God, which had about 120,000 members at its peak. While he was an early pioneer of radio and television evangelism, how did a guy that most people have never heard of get audiences with so many of the world elites? Before we answer that, let me introduce myself. My name is Daniel DeFranco, and I grew up in the Worldwide Church of God. This picture here is from a church event in 1978, and I'm the little guy on the left. Worldwide, compared to mainstream Christianity, had some pretty unorthodox beliefs. We kept the seventh-day Sabbath, biblical dietary laws, and the annual biblical festivals. Basically, we believed that the Old Testament was as relevant to believers as the New. I really enjoyed being a part of the church. I loved going to the feast. I was in both of the church's youth programs, YES and YOU. I went to the church summer camp in Orr, Minnesota for 3 different sessions. And I was also hoping when I graduated high school to go to the church college, Ambassador College. When Herbert Armstrong died in 1986, things on the surface seemed the same. But starting in the early 90s, it was apparent that the new leadership was looking at changing some of the doctrinal beliefs. Several groups broke off, one of the first being the Global Church of God, which later became known as the Living Church of God, and that was started by Rod Meredith. At the time, I was 17, and our family decided to go with Global. The next year, I was baptized and became a member. As an aside, Worldwide ended up breaking up into dozens of splinter groups and became a major impetus in the formation of the Hebrew roots and Torah observant movements. Things in Global were going fine until this guy here tried to force us to meet in one of these here. We left and started our own independent fellowship. I ended up moving to the Cincinnati area and became fairly disillusioned for the next several years. I still kept the Sabbath and the feasts, but my world had been shattered. I was taught that Worldwide was the one true church, but since they made many changes, it was Global carrying the torch, and we were remaining faithful. When I was no longer a part of that, I didn't know what to do. At around age 25, I realized that my spiritual foundation had been on a church and a man, not Christ. That's why I didn't feel grounded. Soon after, I met my lovely wife Jennifer at a feast in Wisconsin. The next year, I moved to Missouri, and we got married. My wife suggested we attend a church, so we started attending a Church of God Seventh-day congregation that her family occasionally visited. I started giving sermons soon after, and was then asked to lead a small independent Bible study fellowship in another city. I've remained in that position for the last 16 years. Although my experience in Worldwide will always be a part of me, it had become a distant memory. That is until 2022. Through a series of circumstances that I will have to convey another time, I came across a video of Herbert Armstrong meeting with world leaders. I had totally forgotten about that. I remember seeing some of the photos and videos as a kid, but I had no idea why he was meeting with them. These meetings also took place before the internet, so there was no going back to review the footage. Once you saw it on TV or at the feast, it was gone. So I started watching the footage. I couldn't believe how many leaders he met with, and these weren't just leaders of tiny island nations, but rather larger influential nations, especially involving major geopolitical hotspots during the 70s and 80s. Another thing that really struck me with these meetings was the language that Herbert used, and I'll talk more about that later. The icing on the cake for me, and what really got me doing research, were the gifts that Herbert gave. The gifts were almost always Steuben crystal, and most of them are obelisks. Yes, obelisks. At this point in my life, I'd been driving a semi for 3 years, and it gave me the perfect opportunity to dive into material from Herbert and from Worldwide. I listened to hundreds of hours of broadcasts, telecasts, and sermons. While there may have been many books and several podcasts about Worldwide and Herbert Armstrong, I hadn't seen anyone discuss his meetings with world leaders. That was the primary objective of my research, and over the next couple of videos, I'll share with you all of my findings, and it should become apparent why it is still relevant nearly 40 years later. Aaron Dean, who was Herbert's personal assistant for the last 6 or so years of his life, explains just how many leaders they met with in this clip from 2023.
With some of the people, again, just so many different leaders, and again, this is a list here, and again, you can't read it from there. This is a list of the dignitaries we met. It lists the kings, it lists the prime ministers, it lists some of the senators and things, it lists a lot of the mayors and governors, it lists, just who they are, and where we met them, what their positions were. Again, we made a copy. I got three-inch 3-ring binders with all this stuff in it. That's why I copied all this stuff. I stole it out of Pasadena when I left because I knew they were going to destroy everything, which they did. So I have more archives in my home than most people have it in their places. So those are all things that happen. And again, some had it. And again, I quit doing some of the lower level officials because the list got so long. So I basically stuck with just ambassadors and world leaders and things that he met. But again, interesting list of people.
How is it that someone is able to meet with this many world leaders? I've heard the following narratives. Number 1, Herbert was God's chosen apostle, preaching the gospel of the kingdom all over the world, particularly to heads of state. Number 2, Herbert paid for photo ops because he was a narcissistic egomaniac. And number 3, I've heard a whole bunch of other narratives that he was an agent for the New World Order or a CIA asset, or that the Ambassador Foundation was a front for money laundering and drug smuggling. Well, let's look at narrative number 2 first. Were these photo ops? Can you get a photo op with a world leader? Sometimes. According to royal.uk, it's possible. As you can read here, audiences are generally reserved for the diplomatic community, but they can be granted to political, religious, or military leaders, as well as people who've made extraordinary achievements in their field. So it's possible. But how about 6 times, though? Here's another clip from Aaron Dean explaining how many times they met with the then Prince, but now King Charles.
There he's meeting with Prince Charles in England. We met with Prince Charles, now King Charles, half a dozen times. We actually spent a whole day with Prince Charles and Princess Diana at the Rothschild estate with the Rothschild brothers. And a fascinating story, another story I'll tell another time.
Did he just say the Rothschilds? Do you mean these Rothschilds? Yep, that's them. However, that's something I'll get into in a later video. Back to the photo ops. Some consider royalty, like in England, to be more of a ceremonial post. I don't agree with that, but let's just say it's true. Perhaps they have the time to do those sort of things. What of leaders who aren't in those positions? Presidents, prime ministers, do they have and or are they willing to have photo ops with just whoever forks out enough cash? I'm inclined to think not. Let's take a look at a wide variety of meetings that Herbert Armstrong had, which helped me come to that conclusion. First, we have a 1973 trip to Lebanon. He met with top dignitaries of political, business, and educational fields, topped off with a 4-hour meeting with the Lebanese president. 4 hours? Interesting. In the same trip, he met with the Lebanese Minister of Education. Where did they meet? At the UNESCO compound in Beirut. For those who don't know, UNESCO is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. March of 1973, Herbert went to New Delhi, but first he stopped in Brussels, Belgium, to pick up King Leopold III of Belgium and bring him along with him on his plane. December 1974, Herbert Armstrong was the first foreigner to meet with new Japanese Prime Minister Miki, even before any ambassadors of any nations. In 1972, while at the residence of Dr. Singh, who was a judge on the World Court, Herbert met with U.S. Ambassador Kenneth Keating, who was a former senator from New York State. Quote, he said he had heard a lot about me and wanted to meet me for some time. He was quite interested in our work for world peace. We arranged with Mr. Rader to visit him the following day at the U.S. Embassy to brief him on it in depth. So Stan Rader privately debriefed a U.S. ambassador at the U.S. Embassy about Herbert Armstrong and his efforts towards world peace. In a March 1973 visit to Okinawa, Herbert was the guest of honor of the Okinawan governor, and the day before he met with the Prime Minister of Thailand at the invitation of Princess Sukarma. May of 1983, Herbert meets with Lord Spencer, who was Princess Diana's father. In that same trip, Herbert was the guest of honor at a reception at Oxford University attended by 40 university officials. September 1974, Herbert had several Japanese senators fly with him on his plane and introduce him to leaders of a number of Central and South American countries. These events are beginning to look a lot more than just photo ops. Japanese senators flying with Herbert on his private plane to meet the leaders of nations? This article also mentions that they met chiefs of protocol in the countries visited, and that further appointments set up with their presidents and any other government leaders that Ambassador College wishes to contact. From the same 1974 trip, Stan Rader says, just as the Japanese opened up Egypt and other areas of the Arab world to the work of God last January, they have now helped us immeasurably in Latin America and South America, so the benefits are truly reciprocal. It's important to remember the time frame these events happened. This was post-World War II. This was pre-globalization. Many nations did not have diplomatic ties with other nations. You also couldn't just stroll into a country to meet the leader unless you were invited. Here we see Japanese Diet members introducing Herbert to leaders from Egypt and Central and South America. As we will see next, Herbert returned the favor. Also from 1974, here's a quote from Herbert's trip to Israel. In order to fully appreciate the significance of Mr. Armstrong bringing these Japanese congressmen to Israel, you have to consider the enormous political significance. This was the first official Japanese trip to Israel, and it comes at a time when Japan, due to its critical dependence on Arab oil, has been forced into a strong pro-Arab position. We all know Japan's strong position in economic and political affairs. We had a wonderful opportunity to really showcase our activities in Israel. Many Israelis now, both those who have known us and those who haven't, have a tremendous respect for Mr. Armstrong at a higher level than ever before. Mr. Rader also said that he, acting as the official advisor to the Japanese delegation, met with various political leaders in Israel and in the occupied territories, and also met for an hour and a half with the Speaker and the Secretary General of the Knesset. At this point, I think it's important to interject that Herbert, usually along with Stan Rader, did these types of things 200 to 300 days a year. During a 4-year stretch, they went to Israel 50 times. That averages out to just a little more than once a month. Here we see in 1974 that Herbert had been to Cairo 4 times alone. In 1981, Herbert met with new Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. Mubarak's predecessor, Anwar Sadat, had just been assassinated 6 weeks earlier. Is that normal for a new president inheriting such turmoil to have photo ops with the leader of a small Christian denomination in Egypt? Especially since Herbert Armstrong was such a public supporter of the peace negotiations, which were the most likely reason that Sadat was killed?
Incidentally, Mr. President, I want to say one thing right straight from the heart. I respect and admire you more than I can tell you. Because you have risked everything in an effort for peace. And your heart has to be in it, and it has to be genuine. And not many will do that. I meet heads of state all over the world, but I have not known one that would risk what you did of acquiring the enmity of the Arab world in order to have peace. Now that takes courage, and you had it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And I'm going to let the world know it, because I reach a part of the world.
Very good. Very good.
Less than a year later, Anwar el-Sadat lost his life for the peace he sought. Shortly after the assassination of President Sadat, Mr. Armstrong returned to Egypt.
I was out to the memorial yesterday where President Sadat lies buried. I did give a little salute, and I just said quietly, "Well, goodbye, my friend."
From November 1980, this article states that Israeli minister Menachem Begin was in a meeting in Tel Aviv with officials, where he stopped his meeting to drive to Jerusalem to meet with Herbert Armstrong. When it was mentioned that he had made this special drive, interrupting an important group meeting, he said, quote, "Mr. Armstrong, I would get out of bed at 2 in the morning to come see you." We can see here from 1984 that Herbert is meeting with the Director General of UNESCO in Paris. Once again, UNESCO stands for the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. In November of 1984, Herbert addressed 1,700 upper managers of the Japan Life Company, which was a large company of 60,000 employees. The company president flew with Herbert on his plane to Los Angeles. Herbert didn't just meet with political leaders, he also met with many financial, business, and leaders of education as well. From the October-November 1972 issue of the Plain Truth magazine, I have just come from the residence of Prime Minister Tanaka, Japan's new premier. Mr. Tanaka was installed in the Prime Minister's office only 2 weeks ago. This was a preliminary meeting. One of longer duration is planned for later in the week, but I needed to see him this morning, if only briefly because we had a planned cover story on him in this issue of the Plain Truth, and I had a deadline to meet. "Hey, new Prime Minister, I need you to drop what you're doing because I need you to fit into my publishing deadline." Who says stuff like that? At this point, some of you may think that Herbert was full of hot air, and he's either embellishing these stories or flat out making stuff up. If that was the case, why did he continue to have as many meetings as he did, especially in Japan in this case, for the next 12 years? Surely if he was lying, the things he said would get out, and in many cases he would be publicly guilty for libel or slander. From the same article, also, when I had a meeting with Mr. Tanaka in March of this year, he was engaged in an important diet meeting, but excused himself for 15 minutes to meet privately with me, Mr. Rader, and Professor Goto, our Japanese representative. We met in the Prime Minister's private meeting room in the Diet Building. Who was Herbert Armstrong that Prime Ministers put their meetings on pause to meet with him? January 1979. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin was tied up in a meeting. According to Stan Rader, I had to make a decision as to whether we should wait and take a chance on offending not only the President of Israel, but other dignitaries that were assembled at the presidential palace for what was to be the final tribute to Mr. Armstrong for another decade of effort. At the last moment, I sent the TV camera people away and told them to get onto the presidential residence, and we would wait another 10 or 15 minutes at the most. Hopefully during that period, we would see Mr. Begin. Just so we are clear, Herbert is scheduled for a meeting at the presidential palace with the Prime Minister of Israel to pay tribute to Herbert for his last decade's worth of work that he's done in Israel, which, by the way, Herbert spent more time in Israel than any other country by far. And Herbert and Stan were wondering if they could wait around another 10 or 15 minutes for him. If the photo op is the goal, wouldn't that defeat the purpose? Philippines, 1974. Herbert Armstrong was the guest of honor for about 400 government officials, businessmen, and civic and religious leaders, including members of the Knights of Columbus. This was very common, not only for Herbert to be the guest of honor with the top leaders of countries in many fields, but also speaking to suspect groups like Knights of Columbus and Rotary International. He was also, at this trip, conferred his second honorary doctorate from Angeles University, a Catholic institution. This was only the second honorary doctorate from this university. The first was given to President Ferdinand Marcos. May of 1972. Herbert meets with the Minister of Education of South Korea. Herbert was concerned that they didn't have compulsory education for young children. Herbert said that several countries he had visited are now instituting compulsory education for at least the first few elementary grades including India, Ceylon, Thailand, Nepal, and South Vietnam. Quote, I've had long discussions with a number of ministers of education in several countries around the world. The suggestion was given to me from one minister of education that I call a World Congress at Pasadena of ministers of education from many nations over the world. I am assured that many would attend, and it is under consideration. There's a whole lot here that I'm not even going to bother to get into right now, but this just goes to show that Herbert didn't just meet with political leaders. On a 1974 trip to Jordan, Herbert had a meeting with King Hussein and did have a picture taken, but he also met with other members of the royal family and had a 45-minute meeting with the Prime Minister where no photo was taken. And he also had meetings with government officials, including a 90-minute meeting with their Minister of Culture and Information.
After the first two speakers, the audience was privileged to hear from His Imperial Highness Prince Mikasa, the brother of Emperor Hirohito. Prince Mikasa, a longtime close friend of Mr. Armstrong, dating back to their initial meeting in 1968, asked the entire audience to join him in honoring Mr. Armstrong with a toast.
Dr. Armstrong, ladies and gentlemen, I've been associated with Dr. Armstrong for a number of years, and personally I forgot when I first met Dr. Armstrong. So I asked him, when did we first meet? And he remembered very clearly. It was in 1968. Since then, Dr. Armstrong has been very kind to me, and I have kept a close friendship with him. Not only that, but as you heard in the speeches, Dr. Armstrong has helped the academic affairs of Japan, as well as world peace. We were told that this July you will be celebrating your 90th anniversary. This is a most festive occasion, but as we well know nowadays, the longevity of the human race is extending, so that I hope you will live a long, healthy life, well beyond 90 years. For that, we give this toast.
Dr. Armstrong.
Who gets toasted not just by politicians and university presidents, but royalty? Many of the meetings Herbert had were not photographed or videotaped. Some of the regular meetings that weren't recorded are the most interesting. In 1973, 1975, and possibly a few other times, Herbert met with Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. One of the things Prince Bernhard is known for is starting the World Wildlife Federation. WWF has been in hot water in recent years for scandals. In other words, a benevolent organization doing good deeds publicly to cover for not so good things they do behind closed doors. If you're not aware, that's very common with the power and money elites of the world. However, Prince Bernhard is even more well known for having been the co-founder of the Bilderberg Group. If you're not aware, the Bilderberg Group is an annual secret convention of world elites where they do who knows what, but I can assure you it's not going to benefit the average human being. I wonder why Herbert was meeting with him. I could have spent several hours on more material just like this, proving that these meetings couldn't just be photo ops. There was certainly something more going on here. Herbert met with all of these leaders, but there was little to no press coverage, especially in the United States. The footage that I showed you was solely from Worldwide Church of God archives. So if narrative 2 of the photo ops doesn't hold up, what of the other narratives? Well, I'm going to release several more videos on the topic, and I'll let you decide for yourself. Thanks for watching. Please hit the subscribe button so you can be notified when the next video comes out.